Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post, publisher of more than 1,000 comic books and marketing expert covering MLK would have destroyed DEI. Let's get into the story. Before we do, please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate you guys. Coming from Newsweek, DEI proponents should not celebrate Martin Luther King Day. Coming from The Spectator, the truth about Martin Luther King. But from the Griot, MLK was a woke critical race theorist who fought for diversity, equity, and inclusion. Today's conservatives would have vilified the real Martin Luther King Jr. for fighting for everything they hate. Absolutely not true. But if you do a search, like I did for MLK woke, you see article after article trying to push that DEI and the woke agenda is something that Martin Luther King would have approved of. Absolutely not true. I'm going to prove it to you in just a second. But look at some of these headlines. MLK was a woke critical race theorist who fought for diversity, equity, and inclusion. No, not true. How Martin Luther King Jr.'s words have been co-opted. They're saying co-opted by the conservative right and normal people just because we say that people should be judged based on who they are and how they behave themselves, not based on what they look like. Martin Luther King Jr. was woke, reclaiming woke, celebrating the legacy of Martin Luther King. That is not true. Coming from Newsweek, this is by Christian Watson, who's part of this great organization advocating for race-blind America. The author is black. Not that that should matter. He's just a person. It doesn't matter what he looks like. But he understands how important it is that we all treat each other the same and with dignity. Americans established Martin Luther King Day Jr. to celebrate the man and his righteous quest for all Americans to have equal justice under the law. Martin Luther King Day reminds us that anyone can succeed in America if they hope and resolve. The day also commemorates the beauty of King's vision of Americans living together in harmony. But the woke activists are now pushing diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across the country effectively reach the opposite of every positive belief King held, from encouraging riots to abandoning the vision of a colorblind America. Today's woke activists have no legitimate right to act as champions of King's legacy. Diversity activists today do not want a colorblind America. In fact, they want to stoke racial divisions by embracing the Jim Crow tradition of race-based discrimination. As King wisely noted, quote, "That old law about an eye for an eye leaves everybody blind. The time is always right to do the right thing." But DEI proponents claim the route to equity, a term they have used to supplant genuine equality, requires affirmative racial discrimination in reverse. It is not enough to provide equal opportunity for all Americans. Corporations, universities, and other organizations must prioritize race, even if they do so to the detriment of everything else. At its foundation, DEI does not support the notion that all men are created equal. DEI proponents assume racial minorities are still placed at an inherent structural disadvantage and that white America is systemically racist. In turn, they demand corrective intervention by institutions in the form of DEI training. They also assume that supposed systemic injustice can only be corrected by woke principles, such as giving blacks affirmative preference over whites in hiring and promotion decisions. They argue it is only possible to fight injustice with equally unjust tactics. In short, they do not believe non-white Americans can succeed on an even playing field. DEI advocates rarely cop to the last presumption explicitly, but their actions speak for themselves. King's ethos was, at its core, firmly and unequivocally against discrimination. Quote, "Discrimination is a hellhound that gnaws at Negroes in every waking moment of their lives to remind them that the lie of their inferiority is accepted as truth in the society dominating them." It is clear that King opposed all forms of discrimination. He would thus find modern DEI ideological subjugation to be abhorrent. Moreover, King would despise the notion that DEI speaks for all Black Americans, or that Black Americans should be considered as a group rather than unique individuals. As King noted, quote, "I came to the conclusion that there is an existential moment in your life when you must decide to speak for yourself. Nobody else can speak for you." Equality, not equity, is central to King's ethos. Equality, woven into America's founding via the Declaration of Independence, is the belief that all human beings possess the same fundamental human dignity regardless of skin color or other arbitrary distinctions. Equity, as it's used by modern DEI and critical race theory ideologues, is the notion that certain groups of people are disadvantaged and therefore deserve special treatment over more privileged groups. However, recall one of King's most famous admonitions. Quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." DEI initiatives revolt against the civil rights movement's emphasis on genuine equality over equity. Woke advocates cannot browbeat people with their divisive measures while simultaneously claiming to uphold King's colorblind vision. Equity and equality cannot coexist. Either you believe everyone is an indivisible individual, endowed with moral and legal equality, or you believe that we are all parts of different groups in perpetual tension with one another. King's struggle for the former proposition cannot be easily dismissed. Another thing the woke people deliberately leave out is that Reverend Martin Luther King was a man of religion and a man of faith. From The Spectator, the truth about Martin Luther King. Why does the United States seem to be falling apart? The ideal that used to bring Americans together seems to have failed in some way. Liberty and justice for all is the best summary. Sure, it was always a frail creed and interpretations of it differed, but still it worked. The creed failed in a very paradoxical way. It was voiced too well, too purely. Its greatest articulator was Dr. Martin Luther King, who is commemorated with a U.S. national holiday. The problem, of course, was that Dr. King was black. Half of white America found this hard to take, that the incarnation of the national ideal did not look like them. But another aspect of his identity also served to alienate about half of Americans. King was a liberal Protestant Christian. He was, above all else, a clergyman, like his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before him. Very simply, liberal Protestantism developed in the 19th century, that would be the 1800s, out of a perceived need to adapt Christianity to a modern intellectual context. MLK said, quote, "All that I do in civil rights, I do because I consider it part of my ministry. I have no other ambitions in life but to achieve excellence in the Christian ministry. I don't plan to run for any political office. I don't plan to do anything but remain a preacher. To remember King while ignoring his faith is not to remember King at all. Yet today he is often venerated by those who have very little interest in his Protestant Christian message. His repeated emphasis on forgiveness and loving enemies is not the spirit that animates today's statue topplers. Why was King's liberal Protestantism such a crucial underpinning of the American ideal? Because it was capable just about of holding together religious conservatives and the rest. It's America's glue. Or was, for it seems to have dried up. King stumbled into politics during his first real job as a young Baptist minister in Montgomery, Alabama. When Rosa Parks' bus boycott took off, it needed an organizer. Emmett Till had been lynched in Mississippi a few months earlier, so violent retaliation seemed in the cards. But King began to see himself as a peacemaker on a national scale. In 1957, he founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with the slogan, quote, "To save the soul of America." In fact, its target was global, for he linked his work to the decolonization underway in Africa. At Ghana's independence ceremony, he prayed that it will come in this generation the day when all men will recognize the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. This fusion of the Bible and humanism was the staple of liberal theological colleges, including Boston University, where he had studied. The mood was influenced by exiles from the Nazis, such as Paul Tillich, and also by Protestant missionaries who had become passionate advocates of racial equality and were open to ideas from other faiths, including Gandhi's nonviolent protest. More moderate liberal Christians were reassured by the avuncular presence of Reinhold Niebuhr, arch advocate of Christianity's compatibility with liberal democracy. In short, liberal Protestantism was in a bold, expansive phase. In the early 1960s, King's rhetoric became more focused on the spiritual identity of America. In his famous Washington speech, he went straight for the spiritual jugular. Quote, "When the architects of our great republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that by all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." No white person could have revived that founding rhetoric with such force. He understood that such rhetoric belonged more to blacks than to whites in a sense, for whites had lost the right to say it sincerely. This was not a new insight. The black campaigner W.E.B. Du Bois had said decades earlier, quote, There are today no truer exponents, which means activists, of the pure human spirit of the Declaration of Independence than the American Negroes. But King did not just grasp the point, he performed it on television. On one level, that speech was an effective bit of campaigning for further racial equality. On another, it was a prophetic sermon imbued with Christian utopianism. But the religious element refuses to stay in a box. King insists that this outlandish vision is at the heart of the nation's politics. This is who we are, if we is to mean anything. But can a nation cope with such an ethos? Maybe it is too demandingly Christian or Christian humanist. Maybe its rejection of tribalism is unrealistic, at odds with human nature. Similarly, can an oppressed minority cope with the role King announced for it? His policy of nonviolence, which he always explained as the Bible's mission, blurs with a sort of cult of holy suffering. Not many people want to hear their political duty is to suffer violence and never retaliate. King would quote Abraham Lincoln by asking, quote, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" And tell white racists that, quote, "We will match your capability to inflict suffering with our capacity to endure suffering. Send your hooded perpetrators of violence into our community at the midnight hour and beat us and leave us half dead, and we will still love you." The Black Power backlash was little surprise. Historical struggles for justice had seldom been peaceful. Why should this one be expected to be meek and mild? Because, King said, the only route to true peace is through nonviolence and forgiveness. Loving your enemies, he said, is the hardest part of the Bible. MLK Day is a predictable cause for online spats, with woke and anti-woke factions angrily denouncing the other side for daring to recruit the man. They seem to prefer such denunciation to actually trying to reflect on what he said and did. There isn't much enemy-loving going on in either side. That's a fair statement. It's hard to love your enemy. We are all separated from King's vision by an immense gulf. His vision was rooted in a particular religious culture, and it collapsed fairly dramatically in the decades after his death. The mainline churches emptied fast. This was partly a matter of whites deciding that Christianity, as King presented it, was just too demanding and too threatening to their idea of themselves. The liberal vision seemed more persuasive in secular form, shorn of the biblical stuff. The author admits that the demise of liberal Protestant theology sounds like a rather niche concern, but it may well lie at the heart of America's deepening ideological troubles. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments below. Always love to see your ideas. Please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you again soon with another video. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.